At the time I'm making this video, there's a Captain America crossover mini-series event coming out called Captain America Cold War, which involves Bucky and the White Wolf teaming up to do something. And it looks like both Captain Americas, Steve and Sam, are trying to stop them, or are fighting each other. And some form of winter is involved, which is why it's called Cold War, even though the phrase has a different connotation. Whatever, this story definitely was partially inspired by the fact that Bucky was called White Wolf in the first Black Panther movie. But I looked at the elements in the trailer Marvel put out for this crossover and couldn't help but feel how familiar they were when it came to Captain America comics. Espionage, superhero fights that are essentially wars, the mere presence of Bucky. And I couldn't help but wonder where it all started. And since you saw the title of this video, I think you can make an educated guess that it started with Captain America Winter Soldier. Written by Ed Brubaker and drawn by Steve Epting, Mike Perkins, and Michael Lark, Captain America Winter Soldier covers 1 to 9 and 11 to 14 of the 2004 Captain America Solo ongoing series. This actually encompasses 2 story arcs, Out of Time and The Winter Soldier, with some other stuff in the middle that I'm really not getting into. So, let's get started. Before the events taking place in the current day, we see the Red Skull meeting with a former Russian general named Alexander Lukin. In case the fact he was hanging out with the Red Skull wasn't enough to show you what type of guy Lukin was, he then shoots the brains out of a Russian superhero sent to apprehend him, Red Guardian. No, this isn't the same guy from the Black Widow movie or Black Widow's husband from the comics. There have actually been several Red Guardians throughout Marvel's history, and the research I did indicates that this was the Krasno-Grinitsky version, who was actually one of the more heroic Red Guardians, even though he was a bit obscure. And don't worry, Grinitsky won't be the only established character to bite it throughout this story. Lukin is selling some of his inventory to the Red Skull, who spots a certain character in a tank. I wonder who that could be. Lukin isn't selling him, but might be willing to exchange him for something the Skull is searching for, the Cosmic Cube. The Red Skull, of course, has no interest in giving the cube away once he gets his hands on it. In the present, the Skull has his filthy mitts on the Cosmic Cube, which nicely coincides with a point in Steve Rogers' life where he's pretty low. The story is taking place right after the events of Avengers Disassembled, so not only does Cap deal with losing several of his close friends, there isn't an Avengers right now, so essentially he's also lost his family. And not making anything easier is the fact that his ex, Agent 13, aka Sharon Carter, is now acting as his personal liaison to S.H.I.E.L.D. The Red Skull plans to power the Cosmic Cube by detonating 3 devices in New York, Paris, and London, causing massive explosions and feeding the energy into the cube. However, before he can give the signal, he gets a call from Lukin asking him for the cube nicely. And when he refuses, he gets shot through the chest, killing him instantly, with his mysterious assassin taking the cube. Steve Rogers wakes up from a nightmare where Bucky dies, except not in the way he remembers. He gets a call from Sharon about the Red Skull's death, and even though he doesn't believe the Skull died in a shocking display of genre savviness, he does consent to have his DNA tested for confirmation. The bastard was living in a clone of Cap's body. Investigating the crime scene leads Cap and Sharon to the Manhattan Doomsday device protected by Crossbones, who escapes and tells the other two sites to detonate the bombs to honor the skull. Unfortunately for the London team, they're gunned down off-panel, which includes C-list villain and, I guess, Red Skull groupie Mother Knight, and their bomb is also stolen. Cap manages to retrieve the Paris WMD from AIM, who were stealing it back, so at least they got one. Interestingly, while in Paris, Ed Brubaker decides to deliver an author filibuster about how the French people fought bravely against the Nazis in World War II and how Cap, hates how the Americans called the French cowards. However, considering one of the most popular memes of the time was the Captain America of the Ultimate Universe yelling how the symbol on his head didn't stand for France, I can't honestly blame him. Meanwhile, we see former Captain America sidekick Jack Monroe leave a bar and get killed by a mysterious assailant. This character is treated with a lot of sympathy and gets an entire issue about his life and how it ended all in tragedy, but I'm skipping over it. It doesn't add much to the overall story. We see that Lucan has the Cosmic Cube and apparently somehow defaced the graves of two former patriotic heroes, the Spirit of 76 and the Patriot, both of whom had taken on the mantle of Captain America after Steve went into the ice to keep up public spirit. Lucan apparently did this to mess with Cap's head, and it seems to have worked as Crossbone shows up to kill Steve and nearly succeeds. But Crossbone realizes that not only is this entirely too easy, he's been set up by Lucan and he leaves. He does make a few other appearances in this story, but that's just set up for the stuff taking place after this story, so not talking about him anymore. Meanwhile, Sharon goes hunting for Jack Monroe, who has been implicated in the Red Skull's murder, only to be captured by Lucan's mysterious assassin, who has seemingly been doing all of his grunt work. Steve and Nick Fury try to figure out why Lucan's doing all this until Fury mentions Lucan's mentor, Vasily Karpov, who Steve had fought alongside with during the war as uneasy allies. While the Invaders, that was the team of Marvel's Golden Age heroes, stopped the Nazis in a battle, a village called Kronos is wrecked to the ground. Here's where we get the retcon about Cap's sidekick Bucky. He wasn't a kid, he only looked like one and was only about 4 years younger than Steve. He was also not just created for propaganda. He was a master assassin who would act as an advanced scout and terminate any potential problems. Karpov tries to get his hands on the weapon the Nazis were using, but it self-destructed and killed his men who approached it. However, Karpov takes a young boy under his wing who lost his mother in the battle, a boy named Alec. Steve goes off to see why his memories are all scrambled as Fury decides against showing him a file about the Winter Soldier, not wanting to destroy his world before confirming the information inside it. Meanwhile, as the Winter Soldier sets up the London WMD and prepares to blame Monroe for it, Sharon Carter's ex-boyfriend, no, I am not talking about Steve, complains to Fury about her missing. Steve, on the other hand, has gone to the place where he fought Zemo before going into the ice, and after dealing with some shenanigans there, realizes that Lucan must be using the cube to mess with him. No sooner than he realizes that, he gets a mental image of Sharon bound and gagged and goes to rescue her. Naturally, it's a trap, but not to kill him. It's so that Sharon can reveal that Lucan's assassin is none other than Bucky! I know, I'm being coy. But if you even have a faint idea about storytelling tropes, the fact that Bucky was going to be the Winter Soldier was telegraphed pretty hard in the story so far and probably wouldn't surprise a first-time reader. Nor would what happened next as Bucky detonates the WMD and kills Sharon's ex-boyfriend. "No, I will not name him," so that Sharon would be inclined to kill the Winter Soldier now that we know he's Bucky. Steve tries to save people in the aftermath and ends up fighting another AIM group. The last member of said group ends up getting shot in the back by the Winter Soldier. And here we get probably one of the most famous exchanges of all time when it comes to Captain America. Steve calling Bucky's name out as a question, and him saying in response, "Who the hell is Bucky?" It was so famous that they did this.
Bucky? Who the hell is Bucky?
Afterwards, Fury shows Cap the file and also tells Sharon that her ex-boyfriend died. "Look, Ed, you're not gonna make me care about a guy who showed up for a single issue. Yeah, that's his whole existence, and was dumped by Sharon because he was insecure about her being Steve's liaison. Just because he died doesn't make him any less of an asshole, and even after dying, he causes a rift between Sharon, who wants to kill Bucky, and Steve, who wants to save him." Fury takes an unofficial strike team to Lucan's HQ, who now has a fully charged cosmic cube. The strike team successfully invades and attacks Lucan right as he's in the middle of a meeting with people from the US government and the UN. They're forced to leave, and as one of the US government's lackeys tries to get Cap to apologize, we get a pretty underrated Steve Rogers moment, where he tells them that he'll apologize to Lucan when hell freezes over. However, it would seem Lucan still wants to toy with Steve, as a file about the Winter Soldier is suddenly dropped into his apartment. The file reveals that Lucar's mentor Karpov had fished up Bucky in hopes of getting the super soldier serum. While he failed on that front, Bucky was a perfect assassin, and for a man like Karpov who felt humiliated by Cap, there was no better revenge than to turn him into the perfect assassin for his own purposes. Steve is pretty broken by this, and Sharon realizes that he needs a friend and asks Fury to contact the Falcon, Sam Wilson, to stand by Steve. Lucan uses the cube to take over a bunch of companies, but it seems using it has taken its toll, as he attacks and puts his friend in the hospital for trying to destroy the cube. It's interesting to look back at how Sam was written back then. He seems a bit older as well, although that just may be the beard. He's also the first person to ask Steve what he wants to do, and when Steve says he wants to save his friend, Sam tells him, okay, that's what they'll do. Meanwhile, Lucan sends the cube away with the Winter Soldier after what he did, which is perfect because all Steve and Sam need to do is find out how to track it with the help of... Unfortunately, Tony can't be seen attacking Cronus right now, as he just fought off a hostile takeover recently, so it's just Steve and Sam. Steve engages Bucky inside a silo where he was supposed to hide the cube, while Falcon beats up the backup. Steve and Bucky fight all the way while Steve tries to convince him of who he is, but unlike the movie, the brainwashing was a bit too thorough in the comic, and Bucky's mind is too far gone to be fixed without a little outside help, as Steve takes the cube from Bucky and tells him to remember who he is. While Steve's plan seemingly works, unfortunately the guilt of what he did comes crashing down all at once on Bucky, and he crushes the cube in his fist, seemingly killing him. Except not really, he was just teleported away. And he wasn't the only one who didn't actually die, as we finally get an answer as to why Lucan was messing with Steve so hard, to the point of overplaying his hand. As the cosmic cube had transferred the Red Skull's consciousness into Lucan's brain at the moment of his death, where the two now fight for control. This story is great, but you probably already knew that if you saw the Winter Soldier movie. The more savvy among you have probably been able to discern that this story takes place after Avengers Disassembled, but before the events of Secret War, as Nick Fury is still in charge of S.H.I.E.L.D., and Maria Hill is nowhere to be seen. We do see that Steve is acting a bit harsher than normal in this story, even before the Red Skull messes with his mind, and this is most likely in response to what happened with the Avengers. But Cap is Cap, and despite whatever he goes through, Ed Brubaker never loses sight of who Steve Rogers is. Lucan and subsequently his mentor Karpov are intriguing villains. On one hand, I felt a bit sympathetic for what they had to go through, but on the other hand, we see Karpov as a bitter old man in his last days, and he hasn't changed much. He's still holding on to a grudge on Steve, who was believed to be dead at the time. Lucan isn't much better, with his nostalgia for the Soviet Union's glory days, and the only noteworthy thing that we know for certain that he did was using the Winter Soldier to assassinate the Red Skull to get the Cosmic Cube. Even then, all he did was use it to take over a bunch of companies and never attempt anything greater, which the Red Skull mocks him for in the end. Looking back at the story, it's hard not to see Lucan as a man who was just lucky enough to be the protege of a high-ranking official and basically inherit the Winter Soldier, as most of the stuff he did to mess with Steve seems to have been pulled off by the Skull. In the end, when I see Lucan, he's just a pathetic man clinging desperately to a past that has long since slipped away. Finally, as for Bucky himself, we don't actually get much outside of the retcon, as he just gets his mind back at the end of the story. So I think the question on everyone's lips is, well, Steve dies, not in the event Civil War, which took place shortly after, but in its aftermath. However, Ed Brubaker always planned to kill Steve. Civil War just sped up the process. Bucky decides to go after Tony Stark, but Stark reveals that Steve wanted Bucky to take up the mantle of Captain America if he died because he felt that he needed direction. And can I say something a bit off topic here? Of course I can, it's my video. After Civil War, various creators at Marvel were pissed at how the event ended, and essentially took it out on Stark, either verbally or physically. Not that he didn't deserve it, mind you. So I find it hilarious that post-Civil War, the title that treats him with the most respect is the Captain America book. Not only does Tony treat Bucky with a lot of respect, when Bucky says that he isn't going to register, he's completely fine with it. If I have to note one thing about Ed Brubaker's Captain America run, probably the most interesting thing, this run may be about Captain America, but the story it's really trying to tell is about the redemption of a hero forced to do things against his will, as he goes from brainwashed assassin to the big good of the Marvel Universe.
I had to, Bucky. Who's Bucky?